Hello, I am Mariana Mazzucato, and I am thrilled to be addressing you today at your Brain Bar Festival. Just very sorry I couldn't come physically. I was very much looking forward to that. So I'm going to give you a brief discussion about my opinions of why we have to rethink the role of the state in capitalism. I'll be drawing on work that I have written about in a book called The Entrepreneurial State, and more recently in The Value of Everything, but also very much from the practical experience I've had over the recent years speaking to policymakers about these issues, and perhaps most importantly within the European Commission, where I was lucky enough to have been asked to write a report on the issue, and the policy tool that I put forwards, which I'll talk to you about towards the end, called the mission-oriented approach, has actually come into being. It now exists as a legal instrument in Europe, and I want to argue that we need to really make sure we use it and take advantage of the opportunities that it presents to us for addressing all sorts of everyday issues, but also some of the bigger challenges that we have today, whether it be the climate crisis or the health pandemic that we're still living through. So first of all, one of the kind of key points that I like to make from the beginning is we really kind of need to start from the beginning, because the way we currently think about the role of the state in economics, and hence how this informs policymakers, is very narrow. There's this idea that, you have the market, and sometimes the market will mess up, things go wrong, and the state has to come in and fix those market failures. So that will justify spending on R&D, research and development, if the private sector is not spending on it, or introducing something like a carbon tax if the private sector is spending too much in areas that create pollution. And those market failures do exist, and of course they should be corrected, and they're often not corrected. But it's very hard to transform a society by simply fixing it when things go wrong. You need imagination. You need to dream about what would a better society actually look like. And so I argue that we need actually a market shaping and a market co-creating framework within economics, and to really use this then to inform and have a serious dialogue with the kind of policies on the ground that should therefore not be justified when there's a market failure, but really be justified in terms of a dialogue with civil society, public and private sectors about what kind of markets do we even want. For example, if we want more inclusion, if we want more sustainability, what are the kind of investments that we actually need, and also new forms of collaborations? What do they look like? In arguing for this, what I wrote about in the Entrepreneurial State is that, you can't explain the history of some of the most important innovations of our time by looking at the market failures that were fixed. So just look at your iPhone. I've got one here. In fact, I should put it on silent. This iPhone is smart and not stupid because of the technology that is inside of it, right? The internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri voice-activated system. And then you needed, a great company like Apple to put those different technologies together into a really well-designed, simple product, which we all want and have too many of probably in our house. Now, all those technologies that I mentioned, which make this phone smart and not stupid, were actually funded by public organizations. DARPA funded the internet, the Navy funded GPS, and so on. And again, that doesn't mean the state made the iPhone. That would be foolish. But without those active state investments, we wouldn't have a smartphone today. We would have a stupid phone. And those investments weren't to fix markets. They were to fix problems. Or how can we say? They were to address problems and find solutions to those problems. So the internet was the solution to actually getting the satellites to communicate. GPS was the solution to know much more precise what was in, for the planes flying, what was in the ocean, for the ships to know what was ahead, and unfortunately in wartime to bomb more precisely. And so this kind of problems orientation, the state having a problem it needed to solve, and then using its different tools like procurement, grants, and loans to foster bottom-up experimentation to reach those goals, is really the history in many ways of all the technology in the iPhone. Or you could argue that's the history of the moon landing. The moon landing, which happened 50 years ago, happened because the government had a very clear goal, getting to the moon and back in one generation. It had a very active public agency, NASA, who was formulated basically in order to fulfill that goal. But it wasn't then done just by NASA. There was lots of different private enterprises in different sectors, like nutrition, materials, textiles, and of course, aeronautics. But all the different solutions that came to the table, all the different problems that had to be solved, required both public and private investment. But again, you couldn't explain the moon landing by the state somehow just fixing the market. It actually came up with the plan and then galvanized and catalyzed through all its different levers, lots of innovation to get us there. And I'll come back to this point towards the end when I kind of reflect on what does that mean for the future. But let's just pause a minute still on the role of the state. So the idea is that, again, all these technologies in here came about not just through public money, but through public organizations, right? So I already mentioned NASA with the moon landing. DARPA is the famous innovation agency which got us the internet. So this is a really important lesson today, if it's true, what I'm saying, and I, of course, would argue it is true because I wrote the book about it, that you need entrepreneurial states to really foster forward-looking innovation, whether it's green energy today or, the man on Mars, perhaps, mission next. Then we also need to think of public sector capacity, but also around the most social problems we have around health and climate change. Again, what's the public sector capacity? So what's the equivalent of DARPA, which funded the internet for the vaccine or health innovation? What's the equivalent of DARPA in different areas that might have to do with cities and innovation around our mobility systems? And unfortunately, because we haven't admitted that the state has this role as active market shaper, market maker, market co-creator, we then haven't asked those questions which have to do with its internal organization. What does it mean for your HR system, human resources? How do you remain adaptable and flexible along the way so you don't just go down a track that's just not working? What does it mean for dynamic information flow across different departments within government? Anyway, so all those are really important questions because history tells us that the kinds of state organizations that were able to really fuel innovation-led growth had to themselves be innovative. And so when we don't ask those questions, we end up perhaps with organizations that are too slow and inertial and bureaucratic and not flexible and adaptable. But there's nothing inevitable in that. It's not because they are public organizations that they are slow. It's because they haven't necessarily gone through this intra-organizational renovation of ideas and rejuvenation and constant rethinking about how to co-create value with different types of actors. The examples I've given you were mainly from the tech sector, but I mentioned quickly health. Most blockbuster drugs out there for so many different diseases were actually, again, financed heavily by the state. So in the United States, $40 billion a year gets spent on health innovation, which finds its way into many of these drugs which we buy globally. And I think one interesting thing is, is it enough just to invest in these drugs when they come about? Is it enough just to invest in all the technologies that are in our iPhones or invest in renewable energy, which also has very much been a result of public investments? The answer is no. If it's the public, if it's the state, if it's taxpayer money, we should make sure we're also governing that process so that citizens benefit. And I do think the health sector is one of the most problematic in this area because, again, lots of public money going in, but then we haven't thought through those issues of how do we make sure we govern the innovation process in such a way that actually benefits people and not just profits. And so the patent system, for example, intellectual property rights, unfortunately, are often too strong. They're too wide, so used for strategic reasons. They're too upstream. So the tools for research themselves are being patented, not just the outcomes of that research. And that has the potential to really block innovation. And that makes very little sense because if you think about it, a patent is it's a contract, right? It's a contract between the state and the private sector. And the state is granting the private sector 20-year monopoly, monopoly profit, so protection. And so in exchange for that, then, the state should be able to demand certain things. For example, let's make sure we don't then abuse that patent. Let's make sure that the patent isn't just used for strategic reasons and isn't too wide. Let's make sure that it's easily licensable, precisely so the state gets its share of the bargain, which is greater diffusion of innovation across the economy. Or you could think of the prices of the drugs themselves. If they're not reflecting that public contribution, that's not a very smart deal that the state has made. 40 billion a year into medicine innovation, and then the medicines are not affordable to the people. So the state has to come back in to subsidize that process through the welfare state. Anyway, this issue of governance is just as important, of course, today with digital technologies, like I mentioned before. With COVID, we are witnessing a massive tragedy right now in terms of many kids not being properly educated because of the lockdown, and so a digital divide, right? And that concept of the digital divide has made many think about, how do we make sure that those less well-off continue to have access to education? But again, this is a typical area where you could say precisely because the digital products were invested by the government, it really should have been thinking about these things ex ante, not just ex post. And here I find it quite inspiring how some cities, like the city of Barcelona in Spain, through the leadership of the mayor, Ada Colau, thought through that. How can we make citizens who are benefiting from the data that they create every time they click on an app like Citymapper? And so what they did in the city of Barcelona, they brought in a hacking team into the city government precisely to make sure that, or to find ways so that the benefits of this data generation came back to the city that then could improve, say, public transport, right? Another example of that issue of governance, again, from COVID-19, is this issue around the race for the vaccine. Lots of public and private money going into the vaccine, but in order to make sure that it actually benefits citizens of the world, the vaccine, of course, has to be universal and has to be accessible. And so that's going to be very hard to do if we don't govern that innovation process in a particular way. And the World Health Organization has been very active on this front, arguing that we should actually be pooling the patents to really foster what they call collective intelligence, which I think is a fantastic word. And I do think a lot of what governments should be doing in the innovation area should be to govern and ensure collective intelligence so everyone's benefiting from such important areas. But again, also, it's not just a vaccine. There's new therapies coming about, for example, remdesivir, a new drug. The fact that it received $70 million from the US government, but then was marketed by Gilead for over $3,200 for dosage, it just doesn't sound right, does it? Anyway, so there's that governance challenge, which is hugely important when we admit that the public sector has this very active entrepreneurial role when it's effective. And I already mentioned the organizational challenge as well, really building that dynamic public sector capacity within particular types of agencies. In the entrepreneurial state, by the way, I talked about this in terms of needing an entrepreneurial state, not just as one big block, kind of big brother, throwing a lot of money into the system, but also in its distributive capacity. So a dynamic network of decentralized state agencies across the whole innovation chain. That would include organizations both upstream on basic R&D, downstream science industry linkages, more downstream patient long-term finance, providing that patient finance to innovative companies, and then procurement policy on the demand side. And that patient finance that I just mentioned is quite important because you will, of course, have heard of venture capital. And venture capital is often exit-driven. They want to exit in 5 or 10 years. Sorry, not 5 or 10 years, 3 or 5 years, sometimes 10 years. But by having already that eye on the exit, there's kind of this rush in the process, right? And a lot of science-based industries in biotech and nanotech and clean tech or in space need time. The concept of learning by doing means you need to do and trial and error. And again, science takes time. A lot of research, the fruits of it only come about after 20 or 30 years. So that kind of patient long-term finance being provided by public sources is very important, as well as the redesign, as I was mentioning, of the demand side tools, for example, through procurement. Anyway, so now what I did on a practical level is I brought this idea to different governments that have been working across the world on some of these issues, especially in areas where the government, unfortunately, isn't not only not investing enough, but doesn't have those dynamic capabilities within the public sector. And using some of these stories and examples from around the world and what we know works, what doesn't work, I've always found quite an inspiring engagement with the policymaking process. Now, more recently, though, I worked with the Commission, here, handily I have it near me, writing this report called Mission-Oriented Research and Innovation in the EU. And really the idea was to, look, isn't this convenient? I even have a board. Think through that moonshot example. So what I argued, sorry if you see this backwards, is that we really need to begin with the big challenges of our time, which are basically the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And each one of those challenges, this is SDG 14, around life underwater, clean oceans, it can be transformed into a very concrete mission. So instead of having a sectoral approach where governments are worried about, is it automobiles, life sciences, financial sector, creative industry that we should worry about, think of the problem. Think of what problems you need to solve. So clean oceans can be transformed into a very concrete problem, which is to get the plastic out, a plastic-free ocean. So this is a kind of a mission at the international level. So a plastic-free ocean mission, reduction of 90% of the plastics entering the marine environment by 2025. And, this can only be done if you get all sorts of different sectors involved. So obviously in marine life areas, but also AI and digital, design, biotech, chemical, waste management. And then the real important thing is that governments need to think about how can they then redesign, rethink the tools, the levers they have, procurement, which I've mentioned, prize schemes, grants and loans to foster as much bottom-up innovation to get there. So here's some bottom-up innovation, plastic and microplastic digestion mechanism, autonomous ocean stations to remove plastic pollution, reuse of packing items through personalized collection services, image recognition and deep learning waste separation system for domestic and marine waste. Anyway, these are just examples, but this idea that you begin with a challenge, one of the SDGs, turn it into a mission, whether it's an international mission like this, national or city level, regional level. Think of all the different sectors that are going to be game players here, working together to make it happen, and use the levers that government has, grants, loan, prizes, procurement, to make that happen, to really catalyze that bottom-up experimentation. Another one we worked with in Europe was this idea of 100 carbon neutral cities by 2030. Again, climate change being the challenge, the mission here, lots of different sectors as different as real estate, construction, mobility, etc., and lots of bottom-up projects. I personally think this is a really interesting approach because the status quo is instead to make a list of sectors or a list of types of companies you want to support. There's a lot of myths around startups, for example, or SMEs. And the SMEs themselves, the small, medium enterprises, don't benefit from being mythologized. What they actually need is to scale up. You don't just start up, you need to scale up. And historically, it's been precisely when the public sector had real goals that then it was able to actually create a market for those startups that were interested in helping the government fulfill those goals. And you can imagine those goals today could be around all sorts of areas, whether it's around the digital divide, different types of climate issues, the future mobility in cities, and really helping the SME population to help the city, the region, the government, the European Union fulfill those missions is very important. But that requires a redesign of the instruments, away from blanket SME policy to, for example, procurement policy that is aimed at helping, say, 3% of the budget in each of the different departments to be directed towards those kinds of small companies that can help think about different solutions. But, this issue also that many of these projects will fail. There's about 500 of these bubbles here that got us to the moon. That means we also need to be open to welcoming risk-taking and uncertainty and failure within government, which is not often the case, but also that issue of adaptability and flexibility. And I'll just close by saying that I really think all these concepts are fundamental today. We cannot keep going from crisis to crisis to crisis, whether it's a financial crisis, a climate crisis, or a health crisis. We need different tools to also prepare us so that when crises do arrive, we're better prepared and we have the kind of institutional capacity, the dynamic capabilities to confront them. And unfortunately, with COVID-19, we really saw that at least in the healthcare sector, but also in the digital sector, we weren't prepared. We didn't have that capacity. And it almost becomes an insult, if you think about it, just to be clapping for healthcare workers on Thursdays, as we did in the UK, when we haven't financed properly the healthcare system But even when we properly finance a healthcare system, we need to be doing it in the most imaginative way that takes into consideration many of the issues I'm bringing up, both in terms of that organizational capacity. You know, do we need an ARPA H like we had DARPA? H meaning health. What does it mean, again, to actually govern the process of that health innovation so we're sure that citizens are really benefiting and we have a citizen focus on the innovation process itself? But also really breaking down those challenges. As I mentioned before, the mission being not just a vaccine, but a universal and fully accessible vaccine, because with any pandemic, we're only as healthy as our neighbor is. It doesn't make sense for just one part of the world to be vaccinated. That again, that issue of a very concrete mission of 100% universally and accessibly available vaccine itself would start to make sure that we are governing that process properly, because we've created a very clear target for that. Similarly, when I was working with the UK government around their future mobility strategy, saying 100% accessible public transport system means that we need a lot of innovation bottom up from the area of disabilities, right? Because there's a very specific problem, make that public transport system accessible, then, you know, different solutions, experimentation, creativity required around thinking about the challenges that disabled people have. And you know, again, I think what's quite interesting, at least that I've learned in working with different task forces around the world, is that things happen really quickly with COVID that somehow countries had not been able to do for decades before that. In Italy, for example, the country where I'm from found itself with almost zero capacity in terms of producing personal protection equipment when COVID-19 struck. And then actually, because they saw it as an emergency, almost as a wartime emergency, and got a commissioner who had actually military background to kind of govern the process alongside the prime minister and the ministries, they were very quickly able to catalyze capacity within the Italian private sector using, again, a quick change to their procurement law, which they wouldn't have been able to do in normal times, which today has produced 139 companies in Italy which are producing personal protection equipment. So Italy today is fully autonomous in its PPE. It doesn't mean it's perfect, surely, I don't know, but I'm sure there was problems that arose along the way. But the point is that when we see something almost from a battleground lens, a national security lens, we tend to react much quicker. We should learn from those processes so that in normal times, we're also acting strategically in a mission-oriented way with public finance, co-investing with the private sector, but treating, you know, climate change as an emergency, treating inequality as an emergency. We should remember the term, the war on poverty, requires not just saying the war on poverty, but again, thinking about what it means for the transformation of structures and tools on the ground. And I'll really close now by saying that I do think that in order to do this, we need a very different form of public-private partnerships. And the concept of stakeholder capitalism, I think, is a very strong one. And I think we should be learning from that in order to think about how to bring different voices to the table and different types of partnerships to the table. So if we don't just want shareholder maximization within corporate governance structures, this is a big topic globally, we need to think what is alternative to that. And stakeholder value, that term has been used to talk about it, but we haven't gotten our hands dirty in constructing it. And I really think that this mission-oriented approach, where you have public, private, third sector, citizen groups together finding solutions for the biggest problems we have, and the SDGs are definitely a good place to begin, require a new relationship between these different actors. And this concept of stakeholder value should be not just about corporate governance, as important as that is, you know, getting workers on the board, et cetera, but also in terms of new ways of engaging citizen groups, new voices, to even imagine what kind of future we want to live in. That includes trade unions, that includes student groups, you know, green movements. So instead of just top down, you know, telling society we need a green city, a carbon neutral city, let's get our hands dirty together to even think about what does that mean? What kind of city do we want to live in? How can we together make it sustainable? Anyway, I really hope you have a wonderful conference. I'm very sorry again that I couldn't join you. And I hope that these reflections help stimulate some thought. And also very much hope to be coming to Budapest soon. Bye-bye.